Today we will be reviewing a paper by Knudsen published in 2007 about the neural predictors of purchases. Now we will address what was known before we selected our research article and what particular gap in knowledge this experiment tried to address. Before reviewing this article, we knew that people typically consider characteristics of available purchases, determine their cost, and then decide whether or not to purchase. A growing number of fMRI studies have explored these neural correlates of product preference so that we can maybe better decide what people are more likely to purchase. Recent findings implicate the mesolimbic dopamine projections areas in the representation of anticipated gain. However, they do not clarify the different roles of these distinct projection areas. Unlike studies that focus on how preferences are established, this study instead focused on people how decide to purchase based on already established preferences. We also knew that people are much more sensitive to losses than gains, and that greatly affects their purchasing decisions, because the possibility of attaining a product or service may be seen as more of a loss than a gain depending on the individual preference and price. This experiment aimed to specifically address the exact brain mechanisms and circuits that mediates our purchasing decisions, with the hope to better predict people's purchasing decisions. The specific research question asked in this article was, do distinct neural circuits respond to product preference versus excessive prices, and to explore whether anticipatory activation extracted from these regions could independently predict subsequent decisions to purchase. So, what was the specific task and analysis methods used in this study? Subjects were scanned while engaging in a SHOP task, SHOP standing for Save, Holdings, or Purchase, which consisted of a series of trials of identical temporal structure in which subjects could purchase products. Subjects saw a labeled product for 4 seconds, then saw the product's price for 4 seconds, and then chose either to purchase the product or not by selecting yes or no, presented randomly on the left side or the right side of the screen. Then they would fixate on a crosshair for 2 seconds to act as a retention period before the onset of their next trial. So before we get into what the authors found in this study, we're just going to go over some basic review of the concepts. So purchases were the consumer preferences mediated with the price, and that there's a constant competition between the pleasure of acquisition and the pain of paying. As well, there was 3 main brain regions investigated in this study, and they were the nucleus accumbens, the mesial prefrontal cortex, and the insula. So to act as a neuroanatomy refresher, we're just going to remind everyone what these regions are typically known for. The nucleus accumbens is a structure in the ventral striatum and is a part of the mesolimbic system, which is a reward/dopaminergic pathway in the brain cell.
The last region in the brain that was analyzed during the study was the insula, and is the region that is deep within the brain, which kind of makes it difficult to explore. But emerging evidence has connected it with providing emotional context to physical experiences. It has also been connected to pain perception, conscious desires, bodily awareness, and a sense of self.
So what did they find in this study? They found that the nucleus accumbens activation was positively correlated with preference during the product and price periods, so when the product was displayed. They also found that the mesial prefrontal cortex, or the MPFC, had activation that was positively correlated with the price differential during the price period, so when the price was displayed. They also found that insula activation was negatively correlated with the purchasing during the choice periods, so when the subjects chose to purchase or not.
As well, based on predicted and subsequently verified initial points of significant divergence in activation, they included the bilateral average nucleus accumbens activation during the product period, the bilateral average mesial prefrontal cortex during the price period, and right insula activation during the price period in subsequent prediction analyses.
Therefore, we saw that the activation in the hypothesized regions, the nucleus accumbens, the MPFC, and the insula conformed to most, but not all, predictions. Activation in these 3 regions correlated more robustly with subjective variables, so product preference, the price differential. Reminder that the price differential is the difference between what subjects are willing to pay and the presented price of the objects. They correlated more with subjective values rather than objective values like the product identity and the overall price.
Adding on to prior literature, the findings in this paper suggest that decisions to purchase products may involve distinct dimensions related to anticipated gain and loss, rather than a single dimension framework to anticipated gain. There are also links to studies on social decisions that implicate NACC activation and the intention to cooperate, and INCIL activation and the intention to defect in making decisions on purchasing products.
The authors also found that activation in regions associated with anticipating gain, the nucleus accumbens, correlated with product preference, while activation in regions associated with anticipating loss, the insula, correlated with excessive prices. Together, these findings suggest that activation of distinct brain regions related to anticipation of gains and losses precedes and can be used to predict purchasing decisions. These findings are consistent with the idea that people do not react as much to absolute price as the price relative to what they think is acceptable given that product, making it difficult to determine whether prices are high or low without knowing the associated product.
The results of this paper fit within the larger literature on this topic because purchases are driven by a combination of consumer preference and price. These findings suggest that activation of distinct neural circuits related to anticipatory effect precedes and supports consumers' purchasing decisions. The economic method used offered the hope of separating and characterizing distinct components of the purchase decision process by individual consumers. These purchases are driven by consumer preference and price. With that being said, several other brain regions have been implicated in decision-making in both comparative and human research. However, these regions did not play central roles in the shop task. Because product and price presentation overlapped in time, product preference and price differential were modeled simultaneously during price presentation to ensure that each of these regressors would account for unique variance in brain activation prior to the purchase decision. A limitation in the method used in this paper would include subjects deliberating longer prior to purchasing a product for which they had a relatively weak preference, as well as prior to not purchasing a product for which they had a relatively strong preference. This suggests that reaction time indexed response conflict. To control for these associations, reaction time was included in regression models during the choice period as a covariate.
It is also important to note that this was the first study to use brain activation and neural correlates of consumer reactions to preference versus price to predict purchasing. So we went from having a normal chance prediction, 50% for any guess that you could possibly make, to using brain activation methods, which now allow us to predict purchasing at 60%, which is much more consistent. Another important thing to know about this study is that it meets 3 important criteria for a good study: repeatability, validity, and generalizability. Repeatability because it describes the methods used in this procedure very clearly, so that if one wanted to reproduce the study, they easily could. Validity because they are focusing on specific brain regions that show to have substantial influence on purchasing decisions, therefore highlighting and measuring what is intended for them to measure, those specific circuits. And generalizability because it's specific to this article, but it can be generalized to the overall population.
To summarize the implications of this paper, this study provides initial evidence that specific patterns of brain activation can predict decisions on purchasing. Prior to a decision, preference elicits nucleus accumbens activation, and excessive prices can elicit INCIL activation and medial prefrontal cortex deactivation. Looking closer to the economic side of things, the findings here support the historical notion that individuals have immediate affective reactions to potential gain and loss, which serve as inputs in decisions about whether or not to purchase a product. Implications for understanding behavioral anomalies such as overspending and undersaving when purchasing with credit cards rather than cash are also provided in this study. The abstract nature of credit, coupled with deferred payment, may make consumers less sensitive to the pain of paying. These findings may eventually recommend methods of restructuring institutional incentives to facilitate increased saving.